In this video, we're going to look at the causes of the French Revolution, an overview of the stages of the French Revolution, and then go review the first stage a little more in depth. So there were long-term causes of the French Revolution, one important one being the Enlightenment of 18th century France. If you remember, the philosophes were philosophers who wanted to reform society, and there were several political philosophes. Now before them was the British philosopher John Locke, who lived in the 1600s during the time of the English Civil War and Glorious Revolution. And Locke had wrote about these things called natural rights. And he argued that government existed to protect one's natural rights of life, liberty, and property. And furthermore, if the government, which was created by the people, did not protect these rights, if it actually jeopardized them, then the most important right that individuals had was the right of revolution. So you can see how that clearly is going to inspire the French Revolution. Also, the Glorious Revolution in England, which occurred in 1689, 100 years before the French Revolution. If you remember, in the Glorious Revolution, the people of England forced the monarchs, William and Mary, to sign the English Bill of Rights and established a limited constitutional monarchy. Well, this is going to also inspire the French, and the first stage of the French Revolution, that's the attempt, is to create a limited constitutional monarchy. And then lastly, the American Revolution, which perhaps had the greatest long-range impact. The French saw in America the American colonists overthrow the British monarchy and establish a government based again on these ideas of natural rights. If you think about the American Declaration of Independence, this idea of equality for all people, where the people consent to and create a government that serves them. Well, this is going to be a great inspiration to the French Revolution, and ultimately the French Revolution will lead to an abolishment of the monarchy and the establishment of a republic, which is a direct copy of the American Revolution. Now let's talk about the immediate causes of the French Revolution, the first being the social injustices of the old regime. We talked about how in France there were three estates, the first being the clergy, the second being the nobility, and the third estate being everyone else. Well, according to this old political social system, the first two estates were exempt from taxes, had special privileges and rights that the third estate did not share. So this is going to be a cause for discontent, especially as the middle class rises up. The bourgeoisie, which is the most powerful class of the third estate, it's the middle class. They rise up, and since they are the ones that are creating the businesses and the wealth of France, they have a lot invested in reforming the government. And so when they declared the National Assembly, Louis XVI has to force the first two estates to join the National Assembly and rename it the National Constituent Assembly because of this power of the middle class. The most famous cause of the French Revolution probably is the economic crisis. France was in a considerable amount of debt. This had to do with the financial weaknesses of the monarch Louis XVI, which we talked about. He has to raise this money to pay this debt, and yet his financial ministers prove ineffective. The aristocracy does not want to work with making reforms. He's unable to make them work with making reforms. And there's also the issue of bad harvests, where there's crop failures, and the price of food, in particular bread, which was the staple of the poor man's diet in France, there's this incredible amount of inflation, so the people are hungry. They're at some point in some places starving, and so that's always a bad sign when there's a depression or severe economic crisis. The people are going to turn to the government, and if they feel like the government is not working effectively, they're going to want change. So because Louis cannot get his financial ministers to resolve the situation, the aristocracy is not wanting to work with him, he is forced to call the Estates General, which had not been called since 1614. We talked about this for 175 years in France. The king had ruled the government without a parliament, but now the king is desperate, and he's going to be forced to call the Estates General. And very quickly, the third estate, led by the bourgeoisie, they are going to separate from the Estates General and create the National Assembly, which they feel will be a more fair legislative body where there'll be equal votes and representation. Okay, so now let's look at the four stages of the French Revolution. The first is the one that's the focus of this video. In the first stage of the French Revolution, you have the bourgeoisie, or the middle class, that controlled most of the changes in the reform. It's the bourgeoisie that are the leaders of the National Assembly, and in this stage of the French Revolution, they establish a limited monarchy. Louis XVI and his family are forced by the Women's March to Versailles. Remember, the women go to Versailles and they force the king and his family to come back to Paris. Well, they come back to Paris, but the king at this point, under the new government that the bourgeoisie creates with the National Assembly, the king has limited power, very limited power. The second stage of the French Revolution is the radical stage, in which the people are going to establish a republic, which is a government without a monarch, run by representatives. It's during this stage that it's the most famous radical stage of the French Revolution, where the king is executed, and then you have a lot of the really famous events like the Reign of Terror occurring. That stage of the revolution proves too radical, and there's just too much bloodshed, too much chaos. Countries around the world are now starting to fight wars with France because they don't want this radical revolution spreading to their countries. And so the people are going to rise up and overthrow the radical leaders, the most famous being Maximilien Robespierre, and he's executed. And so then they go to establish a limited republic where there's 5 elected rulers called the Directory, and they try to rein back the chaos of the republic. But they prove to be an ineffective government also, which leads to the final stage of the French Revolution, where Napoleon, a military general for France, rises up, overthrows the Directory, and eventually establishes himself as Emperor of France. And so the irony of the French Revolution is that it started with an attempt to overthrow a monarch who actually Louis XVI he wasn't a very strong or powerful monarch, but they overthrew him, established a republic, which led to a mobocracy, where the mob kind of went crazy, and which created a situation of desperation, which led the people to turn to yet again another single ruler, except this time they didn't get a king, they got a dictator who became emperor, who had far more power than the Louis XVI had ever had in France. So this shows you our timeline in class and the poster we made concerning the National Assembly, and so this will serve as our review of the first stage of the French Revolution, which during this stage is the National Assembly is running the French government. And some significant things we talked about were, well, first of all, the Tennis Court Oath, where they promised to create a constitution for France. And then before that constitution, they drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And our in-class notes on the third objective gave you a nice summary of that. But basically, the idea was that the people were sovereign, the people would be ultimately have the say in government, and that all men would be created equal. It's important to note that it did not specifically include women, and so Olympia de Gouges, which is a French woman, not Mary Wollstonecraft, she's English, but de Gouges creates this Declaration of the Rights of Women and using the language of the Declaration of Rights of Man tries to show how women are rational creatures and they should also benefit from these new rights of the revolution. Unfortunately for the women, they aren't given those during the revolution. Is not that radical. Another important thing we talked about was how the National Assembly actually is going to create the new legislative body of France called the Legislative Assembly, and they are going to have most of the power in France. The government will still be a constitutional monarchy, meaning there will be a king, but Louis has really no powers. He's more of like a figurehead. And this legislative assembly is then going to go on and to create a lot of the reforms that we have on our poster here. They're going to limit the power of the church and make the clergy employees of the state. There's the civil constitution of the clergy down there. They're going to confiscate or take away all of the church lands and sell them off. Sell them off to back the new revolutionary currency, the assignat, the money of the revolution. They're going to reform the economic system of France, getting rid of the old taxes, the old guilds, which were like unions that protected prices and particular workers in the guilds. And so they're going to create a laissez-faire economic system. Makes you think of the physiocrats of the Enlightenment, free and open trade and economy. They're also going to expand suffrage, but only to working men. Only working men can vote and run for office. So this is not a universal male suffrage even. This is a working man suffrage or right to vote. And so that is another way that shows you this is a limited or moderate revolution, because one of the major goals of the bourgeoisie who are running this is to protect private property. They want to reform the government of France and create more equality, but not at the expense of the wealth and property and businesses that the bourgeoisie has spent, decades and even maybe a couple centuries creating. Um, so this those are some of the major events of this first stage of the French Revolution, and our next review video will have to do with the second stage, the radical stage. This is the timeline from your textbook, and it just gives you all 4 stages, the major events of the French Revolution. I'm just quickly going to show you those stages on this timeline. So you have the first stage, which begins with the declaring of the National Assembly and the Tennis Court Oath, which lasts till about 1792. This is the bourgeoisie or moderate stage of the French Revolution. Then you get to the second stage starts in 1792 and lasts until 1795. And this is the radical stage of the French Revolution, where the Reign of Terror, the abolishing of Christianity, occurs. Then you have the third stage, 1795 to 1799, which was the Directory. And then finally here you have the last stage, which really it's a transition period from revolution to empire, is when Napoleon overthrows. He has a coup d'etat, which means an overthrow of the Directory. Let's go back to the focus question that connected to this first stage of the French Revolution. How did the National Constituent Assembly reorganize France? Well, it did that in 4 major areas. In the first way, it reorganized the government and created a constitutional monarchy. Remember, Louis XVI will have very limited powers in this new government. They weren't ready to abolish monarchy and completely change the government of France, but they wanted the monarch to basically be more like a figurehead. The second area had to do with administration, and they used their beliefs from the Age of Reason or the Enlightenment to guide a lot of those choices. So you see that in not only the philosophes' beliefs about political rights that they started to instill, but also their more practical applications of this rationalism. For example, the creation of the metric system, the following of that. You see that organizing France into new departments or districts, reforming the court system. This is the influence of the philosophes and just trying to go about things according to reason, not tradition. The third area had to do with economics. We talked about how they were inspired by the physiocrats to create a open economy without government regulation and without guilds or unions controlling prices and jobs in the economy. And then the fourth aspect had to do with their attack on the Roman Catholic Church with the civil constitution of the clergy, and the decisions they made there, for making the clergy employees of the state, removing the Pope as the authority of the French Church. That is going to be a mistake, because the French people are loyal to not only the revolution, but they're also loyal to the Pope and to their Roman Catholic heritage. And so this is going to cause the French people to start to think, well, am I going to have to make a decision, choice between the two? And eventually, when the revolution in the next stage becomes really radical, this is where they're going to lose a lot of popular support, and it was a mistake that undermined the ultimate goals of the French Revolution.